We are going to study the Maimer Basi Legani Tafshin Mem Aleph, the Rebbe said on Yud Shvat in 1981. Just a brief introduction about the Basi Leganis. The Basi Leganis, the Basi Legani Mamarim, there are 50 of them or so that the Rebbe said over the course of his Nesias that are very important Mamarim. We know that that's how the Rebbe started his leadership with the Basi Legani. So a little overview and introduction on the Basi Leganis. In 1950, the Frierdiker Rebbe had prepared 4 Mamarim for publication, a series of 4 Mamarim of 5 chapters each. The first 2 Mamarim were Basi Legani and Hayesheves Beganim, and the later 2 was one of 5 chapters that would be prepared for Purim, and another one, also 5 chapters for Beis Nissen, the yahrzeit of his father, the Rebbe Rashab. So it was a series of 4 Mamarim, 5 chapters each, a total of 20 chapters in the series. And the first 2 Mamarim were prepared for Yud Shvat, 1950, and Yud Gimel Shvat of 1950. Yud Shvat being the yahrzeit of his grandmother, Rebbetzin Rivka, the wife of the Rebbe Marash, and the Yud Gimel Shvat being the yahrzeit of his mother, Rebbetzin Shter Nesara. Now, this series of 20 chapters was actually a series that the Frierdiker Rebbe had actually said in 1923. Then it was two discourses, 2 Mamarim, divided in 10 chapters each. So one Maimer of 10 chapters, he said on Shabbos Parshas Boi, which was Vahi Betzem Mazeh Yatzu Kol Tzivos Yisrael Meretz Mitzrayim. That was the opening of the first Maimer. And the second Maimer, the following Shabbos, was Vayimer Hashem Matitzak Elai. Another 10 chapters. And that's the series that we have of Basi Legani from the Frierdiker Rebbe is essentially those 2 Mamarim from 1923, but divided again and prepared especially for 1950. So the Rebbe, who was the editor and the director of Kahas, would also prepare notes on the Mamarim, sources, references. And so he had prepared the first 2 discourses. The Frierdiker Rebbe had given him those 2 prepared with opening titles, Basi Legani, and the second Maimer, Hayesheves Beganim. And on Friday of Tes Shvat, Erev Shabbos 1950 was Yud Shvat. So on Friday, the Rebbe entered the Frierdiker Rebbe's office, the room where he davened, the room where he saw people for Yechidus, and where he studied. And he came into his room. It was Friday afternoon, and the Frierdiker Rebbe was sitting at his desk, and he had a siddur. And the Rebbe notes that it was the siddur Torah printed in Brooklyn in Tafshin Aleph in 1941, and it was open to page Mem Hey, page 45, to the end of Hoidu and the beginning of Pasach Aliyah, the preliminary additions to the Mincha afternoon prayer of Friday. And the Rebbe took the kuntras, the booklet that had these 2 Mamarim of Basi Legani and Hayesheves Beganim, and he placed it on the table, and the Frierdiker Rebbe nodded with his head in a sign of approval and satisfaction. The following day, in the morning at 8 a.m. on Shabbos morning of Yud Shvat, the Frierdiker Rebbe passed away. So it becomes clear after the fact, and this is how the Rebbe would refer to these Mamarim Basi Legani, that this is a Maimer that the Frierdiker Rebbe prepared for his stalkus, for the day of his passing. And so the Rebbe looked at it as sort of like a legacy Maimer, a Maimer with messages. The Rebbe once remarked that you can find in this series, the Basi Legani series of the 20 chapters of the Frierdiker Rebbe, you can find answers to all the problems until Mashiach comes. In other words, this was the sort of that farewell message that would keep us going till the end of time. And it was obviously an important series to the Rebbe. Now, the Frierdiker Rebbe had prepared, as I mentioned, the first 2 installments of this 4-part series for Yud and Yud Gimel Shvat. But the second half of the series, which was 1 Maimer of 5 chapters for Purim, another Maimer with 5 chapters for Beis Nissen, which essentially was originally was the second Maimer in this 2-part series that now becomes a 4-part series, if you're still keeping track. He hadn't prepared an opening for either of those two discourses. Now, generally, when the Rebbes would write their own chassidus, their own mamarim, so they would often write a subject matter, especially when it was a series of discourses that, where you had one idea that was explored over several discourses. And they would add, sort of almost like after the fact, they would add an opening paragraph to each of these mamarim, which would typically be a quote from a pasuk, and some analysis of the pasuk, and then launch back into the subject. So for the first half of this series, the first 10 chapters, you have the Maimer Basi Legani and the Maimer Hayeshevas Beganim, those opening paragraphs. But the second half of the series for Purim and for Beis Nissen, the series just continues, chapter 11 through chapter 20. And of course, after the Histalkos, after the Friedrich Rebbe passed away, so the Rebbe, of course, released those other installments as the time came, and in fact, continued to release other chassidus from the Friedrich Rebbe as well later. But the Rebbe would refer to this as the series, the Hemshech, of the Histalkos, the Friedrich Rebbe's of his passing, that he gave, or the series that the Friedrich Rebbe gave to be published for the day of his passing, for Yud Shvat. In fact, that whole year, the Rebbe would keep a copy, this kuntras, he would keep it in his siddur and would constantly be looking at it. He would encourage people to study it and encourage people to look for answers to the questions that they might have. He said that you can find them in this series. There's some very interesting things that when you look at this series, so there's actually it's been said that this series, as I mentioned, Basi Legani, was first delivered by the Friedrich Rebbe in 1923. So there was speculation that this was the first mimer actually that the Rebbe had heard from the Friedrich Rebbe. It had been known that the Rebbe had been to the Friedrich Rebbe for the first time in Tafresh Pei Gimel, 1922, 1923, but it wasn't known exactly when. And so I think there was just a speculation, assumption that was the first time the Rebbe came to the Friedrich Rebbe. The first chassidus he heard was the Maimer Basi Legani, or in its first iteration was the Maimer Vayehi Be'etzem Em Ezayotzo Kol Tzivus Yisrael Tzivus Hashem Mitzrayim. But it doesn't seem to be the case, because not a few years back, an entry in Rabbi Chodakov, the Rebbe's chief of staff, entry in his diary was published, and I think one of the wedding of one of his grandchildren, and in it, in an entry from 1956, Rabbi Chodakov says that today the Rebbe told him that the first time he was by the Friedrich Rebbe, by his father-in-law, was for Sukkot of 1920 of Patafresh Pei Gimel. So that would be Sukkot 1922, which puts him at the Friedrich Rebbe for the first time before in Rostov, before this series actually started. So, but either way, it's certainly significant. And we saw this by the Rebbe, that the Rebbe looked at it and said that everything is addressed in this series. In fact, in the month or so before Yud Shvat of 1951, before the Rebbe officially assumes leadership, the Rebbe encouraged Chassidim to study this mimer, to learn it by heart. And he wrote that it's not so important to learn, hopefully you learn the whole thing by heart, but it's not as important to learn the whole thing by heart as much as it is to have it, the words that you would memorize from this discourse, to have it engraved in your mind. And that from time to time to think about these words, to recall them, to bring them up if somebody is at a moment of uncertainty, to reflect on the words of the Rebbe, and that will help bring them some clarity. So it's certainly a very, very significant. Then, of course, on a year on the first anniversary of the Friedrich Rebbe's yahrzeit, so on Yud Shvat Tafshin Yud Aleph. Now, for that whole year, immediately after the Friedrich Rebbe passed away, Chassidim naturally turned to the Rebbe and already started to look to the Rebbe as the successor of the Friedrich Rebbe. But we know that one of the hallmarks of a Rebbe is that he says chassidus. And so while the Rebbe was farbringing throughout the year and was already taking people kind of to chiddush and guiding people and so on, but the Rebbe hadn't said a mimer. The whole year goes by, and in the lead up to Yud Shvat, to the first anniversary of the yahrzeit of Friedrich Rebbe, Chassidim already, the momentum had built, and the Chassidim were already calling Yud Shvat the day that there will be a farbringing, when the Rebbe will sort of be coordinated officially as the new Rebbe. And we're all familiar with the story. The farbringing started, and the Rebbe spoke during farbringing, and then one of the older Chassidim said, "We want to hear chassidus," and then the Rebbe started to say his first mimer, which is the Maimer Basi Legani. Now, when the Rebbe said this Maimer Basi Legani, the first mimer, he actually divided it into three parts. He said it's 9 chapters. He said 3 chapters, and then there was a break, and they sang songs, and then a second installment, and then a third installment. During the mimer, which you can of course hear, it's all recorded, the Rebbe cried a lot, and the Rebbe quoted from all the Rabbeim. I quoted them all by name. Interestingly, at the first year, 1951, the first Maimer, the Rebbe only quoted from the Alter Rebbe through the Frierdiker Rebbe. And then on Shabbos, the following Shabbos, he said a Maimer of Hayeshev's Beganim and quoted the Baal Shem Tov and the Magid to complete that, quoting from all the Rabbeim by name. And this was something that would happen now all subsequent years in Basi. Whenever the Rebbe said a Maimer Basi Legani, the Rebbe would quote all the Rabbeim starting from the Baal Shem Tov. Each one of them would be quoted by name. Another interesting thing is that, this idea of quoting the Rebbeim by name, interestingly, there's a parallel with when the Rebbe got married. We know that the Rebbe famously said on his anniversary, Tafshin Yadalid, that this day is the day that connected me, the Rebbe, with Chassidim. This was that was the day that bonded them. When the Rebbe married the Frierdiker Rebbe's daughter. And what's interesting is that in the Mamarim that the Frierdiker Rebbe said, during the wedding, during the Rebbe and the Rebbitzins' wedding, there are some themes. One actually relates to what we'll talk about soon in this year's Maimer. There are themes in that Maimer that, those Mamarim that are discussed also in Basi Legani, which is an interesting sort of parallel and similarity, as well as this idea of quoting from all the Rabbeim, even though the Frierdiker Rebbe doesn't do it explicitly. I don't believe in that series, but it's a concept that he spoke about. The Rebbe spoke about the fact that the ancestors come down to a wedding and participate, and quoting from their Torah as a form of invitation. So there's sort of these similarities there. Also, the Frierdiker Rebbe mentions the idea of V'chol hashvin chavivin. So let's talk about that for a moment, actually. So the Maimer starts with Basi Legani, and in almost all of the Basi Leganis, it says Isa b'medrash Rabbah b'imkoimai, or that the Medrash Rabbah quoting on the verse of Basi Legani. Basi Legani is a verse in Shir Hashirim, Song of Songs, and the Medrash Rabbah on Shir Hashirim has a statement, comment to make about this pasuk about Basi Legani, which we'll get into in the Maimer. What's interesting is that what the Medrash says about Basi Legani, which is that God was initially in this world at the time of creation, and then through the sins of 7 generations, he retreated and then was brought back down to this world through 7 tzaddikim in subsequent generations. This idea is discussed in other places as well in the Medrash, almost verbatim. But what's interesting is that in all the Mamar and Basi Legani, in almost all of them, the emphasis is, and this starts in the Frierdiker Rebbe's Maimer, the Medrash Rabbah b'imkoimah, the Medrash Rabbah on this verse, like particularly quoting from this Medrash in particular. And so Chassidim have observed that the Medrash in Shir Hashirim is attributed, the statement in the Medrash in Shir Hashirim is attributed to Rabbi Menachem Chasni, the Rabbi Menachem, the son-in-law of, I think, Rabbi Elazar ben Avuna. So the son-in-law of one of the great sages with the name Menachem. So there's a certain, which it doesn't appear in the other times it appears in the Medrash. So there's certain allusions to this transmission from the Frierdiker Rebbe to his successor, to the Rebbe, in his last Maimer, and then of course the Frierdiker Rebbe, this is his last Maimer, and this becomes the Rebbe's first Maimer. Now, as I mentioned, and also the Frierdiker Rebbe mentions his Maimer, and the Rebbe mentions it again, also quotes it in almost all of the Basi Legani Mamarim, that when quoting the Medrash and saying V'chol hashvin, quoting the Medrash and saying that 7 tzaddikim bring the Shechina back down to this world. So they all mention, when mentioning the 7th generation, Moshe bringing the Shechina down, mentions V'chol hashvin chavivin, that all 7s are beloved, which doesn't appear in that Medrash. That's a Medrash in Vayikra. I think it's in Medrash Vayikra. It's a different Medrash that says Kol hashvin chavivin about a different topic, and yet that was inserted. Frierdiker Rebbe puts it in his Maimer. That brings it in his Maimer, and of course, in the Rebbe's first Maimer in 1951, the Rebbe focuses in on this idea of V'chol hashvin chavivin, and talks about this idea that we're the 7th generation and we're the ones who have to bring the Shechina Lamata. Okay, so let's jump in to the Maimer. So every year, I'm sorry, before we jump back into the Maimer, getting ahead of myself. So as I mentioned, the series was 20 chapters. Starting in 1951, every year the Rebbe would say a Maimer on Yud Shvat with the title Basi Legani, and every year he would focus on another chapter of the Maimer, of the Frierdiker Rebbe's series, and explain it, analyze it, explain it, and so this started in 1951. The Rebbe's first Maimer is based primarily on the first chapter of the Frierdiker Rebbe series. In 1952, the Rebbe's Maimer is based primarily on the second chapter, and so on and so forth. And this went on for 20 years, till Yud Shvat of 1970, when the Rebbe concluded 20 years of Basi Legani Mamarim, explaining another chapter of the Friedrich Rebbe's Maimer. The Yud Shvat of 1970 is a whole special story in its own right. That's when they finished Sefer Torah Mashiach. The anticipation, the excitement that was felt by Chassidim in anticipation of this day, completing the Sefer Torah Mashiach that the Friedrich Rebbe had started in 1942. Then the fact that the Rebbe was finishing the cycle and finishing all the Mamarim, the excitement was immense and enormous. But anyway, following year, 1971, the Rebbe started again. And started again from the beginning, from the first chapter, and every year subsequently would elaborate and focus his attention. His mind would be focused on one of those chapters, going in sequence from the beginning to the end. This ended in 1988. Tavshim Mem Ches was the last year we have a Maimer Basi Legani from the Rebbe, and so we've got essentially 2 years worth of analysis of Mamarim dedicated to each of the first 18 chapters. And the last 2 chapters, 19 and 20, we have just from 1969, 1970. Now, some years, Yud Shvat would fall on Shabbos or Friday. And when Yud Shvat would fall on Friday or Shabbos, so the Farbrengen would, the Rebbe would say more than one Basi Legani. There would be a Basi Legani on Friday night or Shabbos morning, and a Basi Legani also on Matzei Shabbos. Whenever Yud Shvat was Friday or Shabbos, the big Farbrengen would be held Matzei Shabbos. It would be a Farbrengen Shabbos. In the earlier years, it would be a Maimer Friday night, right after Kabbalah Shabbos, before Maimer, there would be a Maimer. And often, it was essentially the same Maimer that the Rebbe would say, just repeat it twice. Obviously, there's never two things that are exactly the same, so there'd be nuances and differences. And some years, they would the Basi Legani of 1977 of Tafshel Lamed Zayin. So notice that Rebbe edited that Maimer, so that was printed with primarily the Maimer of Matzei Shabbos, with the additions from the Friday night, from the Shabbos Maimer, were added as well, but they were kind of kept separate. At any rate, that's how these Maimarim. The Basi Leganis, that's how we arrived at about 50 Basi Leganis over the span of 40 some odd years. So 38 years. Now the Mamarim for this year. So this year we're in the 4th cycle, right? So the first cycle started in 1951, ended in 1970. Second cycle started in 1971, ended in 1990. The third cycle starts in 1991 and ends in 2010. And this 4th cycle of us relearning the Mamarim starts in 2011. And so we are right now in middle of the 4th cycle of studying Basi Legani. So when people talk about the Basi Legani of this year, what's the Basi Legani of this year? I mean, the Basi Legani that corresponds to the chapter of the Friedrich Rebbe's Maimer, depending on where we are in the cycle. So this year's chapter is chapter 11. We're in the 11th chapter and the 4th cycle. Now, so for the 11th chapter of the Basi Legani, as I mentioned earlier, that's really the second half of the series, and really the topic, the tone sort of changes a little bit now in the second half of the series, because this is already the 3rd Maimer of the 4-part series from 1950. So the Rebbe explained this chapter, focused on this chapter in 1961 and in 1981. So the years Tavshin Chafal, Tavshin Mamal. And Tavshin Chafal, if the Rebbe said a Maimer was Yud Shvat, then was Friday. So the Rebbe said a Maimer Friday night, and another Maimer on Matzei Shabbos. So there are 2 Maimarim explaining chapter 11 from the Rebbe in 1961, and 1 Maimer from 1981. We're going to study the Maimer from 1981. And the Maimer's focus is on the 11th chapter of the Hemshech. So what does the Friedrich Rebbe say in the 11th chapter? In the 11th chapter, he talks about what he concludes the second Maimer, Yeshavas Beganim, he concludes chapter 10 talks about this idea of Tzivos Hashem, that the Jewish people, when they leave Egypt, are called Tzivos Hashem, the troops, the hosts, the army of Hashem. And there he brings 3 interpretations of the word Tzva'is. One is that it means tzava, an army or a soldier in the army. Another one is that it means time. And another one that it means color or harmony in color. So the idea of unity. So the idea of unity and the idea of time, it was the focus of last year's Maimer, the Maimer of 1960 and 1980. That's the focus of chapter 10. The Friedrich Rebbe in chapter 10 only touches on this idea that they're called soldiers, but that's something that he gets into now in chapter 11. So we're continuing this discussion. And he says that why the Jewish people called Tzivos Hashem, because tzava is an army or a soldier. A soldier goes to war. Tzvais, the name, the Jewish people are called Tzivos Hashem because God is also called Tzvais. It's one of God's names, one of the 7 names that may not be erased. One of God's names is Tzvais. What's the name Tzvais signify? So the Friedrich Rebbe brings from the Medrash that when God says that when I wage war against the sinners, so that's what I'm called Tzvais. And so he brings from the Shari from Kabbalah that Tzvais is a name of Milchama, of war, and it's in spheres, in the divine attributes, it corresponds to Netzach and Hod. Now, what's this idea of war? So he explains that war is when a king wages war, he might wage war for one of 2 reasons. One reason he'd wage war is it's a calculated war. He wants to expand his borders. He wants to increase taxes and income into his kingdom. So he'll go to war for those reasons. That's a calculated risk that a king takes, a calculated decision to wage war. But then there's another kind of war, and the ultimate true idea of netzach, of victory, which is, and the Friedrich Rebbe says that this is something that only really applies to a great king. The bigger the person, the greater this attribute of victory or of the need to express this attribute within the individual. So he says that this idea is one that's so rooted, this idea to express victory, that's not about a calculation, it's not about gaining anything, it's about simply expressing his kingship, that it's his way and no other way. And this is something that's so rooted in the king, rooted in his essence, which is why the king would be willing to, whereas the first type of war, the king is doing it, calculating, obviously it's expensive to make a war, but ultimately there's a gain, there's a net gain to the treasury and to the income of the kingdom and so on, or expands the borders of the kingdom, expands influence and so on. But with this second type of war, it's all about the king expressing this attribute of victory, of netzach. And therefore, the king is willing to spend whatever it takes to win this war. And so, and he mentions that the king is even willing to splurge and to spend every last bit of his treasures that he has hidden, that he never shares with anyone, that he doesn't show to anybody, that remains hidden, treasures that he had amassed, generations of kings that had amassed this treasure. The king is willing to splurge and spend all of it in order to carry out victory, even give his own life for it. Why? Because this idea of netzach, the attribute of netzach, of victory in the king, is rooted higher than the king's own pleasure for his own life. And so since it's rooted in his essence, beyond even his pleasure for life, therefore he's even willing to give not only the treasures that he possesses, but also his very life to carry out this, to be victorious. And what is that in the analog? In the analog, that is that God gives of his treasures, his treasure, he gives it to the officers who are in charge, presumably the tzaddikim, the rebbes, to then give and spend on the soldiers, the foot soldiers, who are the ones who carry out the king's mission of bringing victory to the king. So this is the chapter of chapter 11 of the Friedrich Rebbe's Maimer, on which our Maimer is based. So the Rebbe, so in the Maimer from 1961, the Rebbe does a deep dive into understanding the idea of tzvos, the name of God, and the sequence of the Jewish people are called Tzivos Hashem before God, and what does it mean Tzivos Hashem, and the idea of Netzach and Hod. There's a lengthy analysis of those ideas. In the Maimer of 1981, we're going to be concerned with mainly understanding what is the idea of Oitzer HaMelech, what is the king's treasure, and what does it mean that he spends it, and why is Netzach, why is this so important to the king? Now, so that's going to be the focus of the Maimer of 1981, understanding this idea of why the Jewish people are called Tzivos Hashem. What does it mean that Netzach has to do with war? What does it mean that the king has a treasure? What does it mean that he spends this treasure for victory? But before we get into it, and it doesn't look like we'll actually start the Maimer today, but I think it's worthwhile, we'll just wrap it up with a letter that the Rebbe wrote not long after the passing of the Friedrich Rebbe. So this is a theme actually that appears in several places, but I think since it's relevant to what we're going to be studying, so I'd like to just read this letter inside. This is a letter that you can find in the Rebbe's Igris Kodesh, volume 3, page Reish Mem Tes, page 249. It's letter Tav Kuf Samaches, so the letter is 568 in the Rebbe's letters, and it's a letter from Yud Zayin Adar Tafshin Yud. 17th of Adar, 1950. So this is one of the first letters the Rebbe wrote after the passing of the Friedrich Rebbe, and it's addressed to Reb Michal Lipsker. Michal Lipsker was a shliach that was sent to Morocco, and so there's not even the first letter to him after the Friedrich passed away, but he was a shliach to Morocco. And in the letter, the Rebbe writes, after talking about some of the logistics about going and contacting Rabbi Gerdetsky and so on, so the Rebbe says like this: Ye'uyin b'kuntras Purim hamuskar poi perik yud aleph. Look into the booklet that came out for Purim. We mentioned that the Friedrich Rebbe's Maimer, his series, was 4 installments. The first 2, Basi Legani Shavas Beganim, came out for Yud and Yud Gimel Shvat. The third one was for Purim, right, which is chapters 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15 of the discourse, the next 5 chapters for Purim, and then the last 5 came out for Beis Nissen. So take a look in the Kuntras for Purim in chapter 11, which would be the opening chapter of the Purim installment, where my father-in-law, the Rebbe, writes like this. He says like this, and this is the Rebbe is quoting from chapter 11, which is our subject, our chapter for this year. The king who is the chosen of the people and greater than the people. And in order to defeat the enemy, he splurges and expends all of his treasures and valuables. Hanesaf, that he had gathered from generation after generation. And furthermore, that his very life, the king sort of disregards. Mafkir is chayiv. He disregards his own life. He's willing to give his own life. And the treasures are open. And the purpose for this is the purpose of opening and splurging on all of these treasures is for the soldiers who are the ones who bring about the victory. So now the Rebbe continues and says like this: Harelanu kulanu remez biur masha'ira. So Rebbe says this is a clear allusion to what happened, the events that happened. The fact that the Friedrich Rebbe writes that the Melech is mashlich chayiv meneged for victory, that he's willing to forfeit his own life for victory. So this is an allusion to the fact that the Friedrich Rebbe gave his life for this victory. And so that's number 1. Number 2, it's also a general lesson, instruction on what path we need to take, which is obviously the path of sacrifice, of bringing about victory. And we also have the obvious and clear guarantee that for each and every one of us, God opens up the treasures and the valuables that had been gathered over the course of many generations. Why? Because we are the soldiers that, and it's us specifically, the emphasis here, who bring about victory. And the Rebbe concludes and says, all of the above mentioned that doesn't require further elaboration and explanation. Because it should be self-understood. As when we would grasp this, sort of visualize this. In other words, that this is something that we can truly internalize. Then we will certainly go confidently in our holy work. It will be successful. And it will be in line and according to the will and the desire of the previous Rebbe. Is waiting to hear good tidings and the Rebbe's signature. So this is just one point where the Rebbe highlights chapter 11 of the Maimer, this idea that all the blessings, all the resources have been granted to us, and we're the ones who are going to bring about this victory. In the Mirz Hashem, in the next class, we will jump into the Rebbe's Maimer from 1981.